At precisely 3:47 on a bitter January morning in 1944, the telephone rang with news that would haunt the Führer for the remainder of the war. The voice on the line belonged to a Luftwaffe squadron commander, a man whose tone carried an unfamiliar tremor, not fear exactly, something stranger, bewilderment laced with reluctant admiration. "Mein Führer," he started, weighing each syllable as though it might detonate. "The Americans have introduced a new fighter unit. They operate P-51 Mustangs marked with crimson tails. Their discipline is absolute. No pilot abandons formation. No one chases personal glory." He hesitated, and the pause expanded like stretched steel about to snap. "In half a year of continuous operations, they haven't surrendered a single bomber to our guns." Adolf Hitler's knuckles bleached white against the telephone receiver. "That's impossible." For 2 brutal years, his Luftwaffe had been shredding American bomber wings. The calculus of air combat favored defenders. Every Reich incursion should have drained B-17s like arterial bleeding. Yet here sat intelligence that violated every tactical premise, every strategic forecast. The Americans had discovered something, or someone, that rewrote the entire equation. What Hitler couldn't comprehend in those pre-dawn minutes would consume him until his final days. The aviators manning those scarlet-tailed Mustangs weren't the golden-haired Übermenschen his propaganda promised would dominate the heavens. They were warriors his entire philosophy declared couldn't possibly exist in that capacity. They were black American flyers, graduates of a Jim Crow training facility in Tuskegee, Alabama, and they were methodically demolishing the fiction of Aryan aerial dominance, one protected bomber run at a time. What unfolded afterward, the Führer's reaction, the extreme countermeasures, the head-on collision between Nazi pseudoscience and irrefutable combat data, would remain among World War II's most closely protected secrets for decades after the last shot was fired. If this narrative has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. There's far more to excavate here, and you won't want to miss where this goes next. 300 miles south of Berlin, Luftwaffe veteran Franz Stiegler peered through his cockpit glass at an approaching bomber formation cutting through broken cloud cover. With 487 combat sorties behind him, Stiegler could identify aircraft from shadow alone. These were B-17 Flying Fortresses, the American heavy bombers that pulverized German industrial centers with ruthless precision. Today's target looked to be Munich's rail infrastructure. But the bombers themselves weren't what seized Stiegler's attention. It was their escorts. Streamlined P-51 Mustangs in regulation olive drab, except for one arresting detail. Brilliant crimson tail assemblies that blazed like arterial spray against the pale winter canvas. Stiegler had crossed paths with these particular escorts on 2 prior occasions. Both encounters had cost his unit disproportionate casualties. These American aviators flew with a rigor that seemed almost un-American, maintaining ironclad defensive formations rather than fragmenting into individual dogfights like glory-starved amateurs. Stiegler powered up his cannons and initiated his attack vector. The red-tailed fighters reacted instantly, not with the aggressive pursuit he anticipated, but with surgical positional shifts that sealed every vulnerability in the bomber envelope. It resembled watching chess masters move pieces across 3 dimensions, each Mustang pilot forecasting his next 3 potential angles of attack and neutralizing them before he could commit. He targeted a straggling B-17 that had drifted below the main formation, its number 3 engine hemorrhaging black smoke. Easy pickings. Stiegler advanced his throttle and plunged from 28,000 feet with the sun masking his approach. The red-tailed Mustang should remain blind to his position for another 8 seconds. 7, 6. A tracer streaked past his canopy at 5 seconds. Impossible. The geometry was all wrong. The angle didn't compute unless... Stiegler craned his neck and spotted a solitary Mustang with scarlet tail surfaces suspended inverted 3,000 feet above the formation. The pilot had somehow predicted the exact attack corridor no German aviator should have telegraphed. The American had been waiting, watching, calculating. Stiegler aborted, his pulse thundering. In 23 months of aerial combat, he'd never encountered pilots who strategized 3 moves ahead like grandmasters. These weren't the reckless American cowboys Goebbels sketched in propaganda transmissions. These were technicians, surgeons of aerial warfare who had dissected every Luftwaffe tactic and engineered countermeasures that bordered on precognition. Back at base, Stigler composed his mission report with unusual specificity. The red-tailed fighters exhibit combat proficiency approximately 40% superior to standard American fighter units. Their bomber protection success rate approaches statistical impossibility. Either the Americans have pioneered revolutionary tactical doctrine, or they've recruited pilots with fundamentally divergent training methodology. What Stigler omitted from his report, what he couldn't quite articulate even internally, was the more profound implication. If black American pilots, men his government taxonomized as racially inferior, were surpassing the Luftwaffe's finest, then everything the Reich had promised about Aryan supremacy was demonstrable fiction. The cognitive dissonance was too catastrophic to confront directly. So Stigler concentrated on technical particulars and left the philosophical chasm unexplored. His report reached a Berlin desk 36 hours later. An intelligence analyst highlighted 3 sentences in crimson pencil and elevated the document through command channels. Within 7 days, it landed on Hitler's desk alongside 17 parallel reports from separate Luftwaffe units, all documenting the identical phenomenon. Extraordinary combat performance from the 332nd Fighter Group and their distinctive crimson-tailed aircraft. The Führer read each report twice, his expression darkening with every page. Reality was staging an armed insurrection against his entire cosmology, and the rebellion was unfolding in clear skies above Germany where everyone could witness it. Something would need to be done. The question was what, and how far he was prepared to go to suppress evidence that undermined the bedrock of Nazi ideology. Hitler convened Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring at the Wolf's Lair on February 12, 1944. Göring arrived braced for the usual barrage, another diatribe about Luftwaffe inadequacies, the customary threats and condemnations. Instead, he discovered the Führer unsettlingly subdued, examining reconnaissance photographs spread across his strategic table like a pathologist analyzing biopsy slides. "Explain these," Hitler said, tapping a photo capturing 3 red-tailed Mustangs shepherding a crippled B-17 through a gap in cloud cover. "Explain to me how the Americans achieve 0 bomber casualties with these specific escorts when our fighters eliminate 20 to 30 bombers per operation with other units." Göring redistributed his considerable bulk from one foot to the other. "Mein Führer, American fighter tactics have evolved across all squadrons. They possess numerical advantages, extended range with auxiliary tanks." "Don't patronize me with platitudes." Hitler's voice descended to the register that preceded his legendary detonations. "I possess 17 field reports chronicling exceptional performance from one particular unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. Do you comprehend what differentiates this unit from others, Reichsmarschall?" Göring's silence provided the answer. Hitler slid another photograph across the table. This one captured by a German reconnaissance aircraft operating at extreme altitude. It depicted American pilots dismounting from their Mustangs at an Italian air base. Even through grainy monochrome resolution, even from 4,000 feet, the pilot's skin tone was unmistakable. "The Americans deployed Negroes to prosecute their war," Hitler said, the word corroding with contempt. "And these Negroes are defeating our premier pilots. Do you comprehend what this signifies? Do you grasp the propaganda catastrophe if this becomes widespread knowledge?" Göring understood with crystalline clarity. Hitler convened Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring at the Wolf's Lair on February 12, 1944. Göring arrived braced for the usual barrage, another diatribe about Luftwaffe inadequacies, the customary threats and condemnations. Instead, he discovered the Führer unsettlingly subdued, examining reconnaissance photographs spread across his strategic table like a pathologist analyzing biopsy slides. "Explain these," Hitler said, tapping a photo capturing 3 red-tailed Mustangs shepherding a crippled B-17 through a gap in cloud cover. Explain to me how the Americans achieve 0 bomber casualties with these specific escorts when our fighters eliminate 20 to 30 bombers per operation with other units. Göring redistributed his considerable bulk from one foot to the other. Mein Führer, American fighter tactics have evolved across all squadrons. They possess numerical advantages, extended range with auxiliary tanks. Don't patronize me with platitudes. Hitler's voice descended to the register that preceded his legendary detonations. I possess 17 field reports chronicling exceptional performance from one particular unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. Do you comprehend what differentiates this unit from others, Reichsmarschall? Göring's silence provided the answer. Hitler slid another photograph across the table. This one captured by a German reconnaissance aircraft operating at extreme altitude. It depicted American pilots dismounting from their Mustangs at an Italian air base. Even through grainy monochrome resolution, even from 4,000 feet, the pilot's skin tone was unmistakable. The Americans deployed Negroes to prosecute their war, Hitler said, the word corroding with contempt. And these Negroes are defeating our premier pilots. Do you comprehend what this signifies? Do you grasp the propaganda catastrophe if this becomes widespread knowledge? Göring understood with crystalline clarity. Nazi racial pseudoscience had constructed an elaborate caste system with Aryans at the zenith and Africans near the foundation. If black pilots were outmatching German aces, the entire ideological architecture collapsed like a structure with corroded supports. Soviet propagandists would gorge themselves on this material for years. American morale would surge skyward. More dangerously, it would spark questions among German civilians already exhausted by years of warfare and shattered promises. What do you recommend, Mein Führer? Göring asked cautiously. Hitler pivoted away from the photographs, gazing through reinforced windows at the East Prussian forest beyond. First, total information quarantine. Any pilot who engages the red-tailed fighters receives explicit directives. 0 discussion of the American pilot's race in official documentation, mess facilities, or correspondence home. Anyone who breaches this directive faces immediate court-martial for sabotaging military morale. He paused. And second, Hitler's voice calcified. You will personally architect a tactical solution that eradicates this unit. I'm indifferent to resource expenditure. I'm indifferent to redeploying squadrons from other theaters. I want the 332nd Fighter Group annihilated completely and conspicuously in a manner that demonstrates Luftwaffe superiority beyond dispute. Göring swallowed with difficulty. Destroying a specific fighter group demanded concentrating forces at predictable intercept coordinates, which meant extracting assets from defensive positions shielding German cities. It meant accepting elevated bomber casualties elsewhere to secure a propaganda triumph against one American unit. The military calculus was absurd, but Göring had learned not to contest Hitler's fixations. I'll develop alternatives immediately, Göring promised. You'll do more than that, Hitler continued. You'll also initiate a parallel intelligence operation. I want comprehensive intelligence on these pilots, selection criteria, training methodology, effectiveness factors. Identify their vulnerabilities, psychological, tactical, anything exploitable. If we cannot defeat them through orthodox means, we'll discover alternative methods. The meeting concluded with Göring departing to execute impossible directives. Hitler remained at his map table, studying the photographs of red-tailed Mustangs with an intensity that crossed into obsession. For a man who had constructed his political movement on theories of racial hierarchy, these pilots represented something more threatening than military opposition. They represented proof that his foundational premises were fraudulent. In subsequent days, Hitler's inner circle detected a transformation in his comportment. He became fixated on aerial engagement reports, demanding updates on every encounter involving the 332nd. When advisors proposed focusing on more urgent strategic concerns, the advancing Soviets, the invasion threat in France, collapsing industrial capacity, Hitler would redirect discussions back to the red-tailed fighters. It was Joseph Goebbels who recognized the deeper psychology at work. The propaganda minister understood that Hitler's ideology demanded perpetual validation through real-world outcomes. Every German military victory served as confirmation of Aryan supremacy. Every technological breakthrough proved the master race's intellectual dominance. But these black American pilots disrupted the narrative in a way that couldn't be rationalized or dismissed. Goebbels approached the dilemma with characteristic cynicism. If the pilots couldn't be vanquished militarily, they would be vanquished narratively. He ordered his ministry to manufacture alternative explanations for the 332nd's success. Perhaps they operated newer aircraft. Perhaps they benefited from less challenging mission assignments. Perhaps they were actually white pilots misidentified by German reconnaissance. The truth was immaterial. Only the narrative mattered. Meanwhile, Göring assembled his tactical planning apparatus. The objective was transparent: engineer a massive aerial engagement that would produce catastrophic losses for the 332nd Fighter Group. The Luftwaffe would sacrifice other strategic advantages to concentrate overwhelming force at a singular point where the red-tailed Mustangs could be isolated and obliterated. But orchestrating such an operation proved more labyrinthine than anticipated. The 332nd didn't operate autonomously. They were integrated into larger American bomber streams protected by multiple fighter groups. Isolating them required predicting their assignment schedule. Classified information. It meant penetrating American operational security or achieving extraordinary fortune. Göring's staff initiated signals intelligence monitoring, analyzed mission patterns, attempted to decrypt American communications. They constructed statistical models forecasting which bomber formations the 332nd would escort based on target profiles and historical assignments. It was intelligence work on a scale typically reserved for major strategic operations, all focused on destroying one fighter group for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with protecting an ideology from inconvenient facts. Captain Robert Wilson felt G-forces compress his vertebrae as he inverted his Mustang, suspended from harness straps while scanning the sky below for German interceptors. The bomber formation under his protection, 18 B-17s destined for Stuttgart, droned forward at 24,000 feet, their contrails inscribing white trajectories across the February sky like chalk strokes on azure slate. Wilson's radio crackled. Bandits, 9 o'clock high, 12 plus. He identified them instantly. A formation of Focke-Wulf 19s plummeting from 30,000 feet, sun masking their approach, angling at 60 degrees, calculated to slice through the bomber formation before escorts could intercept. Standard Luftwaffe methodology, but executed with exceptional precision. These weren't the depleted replacement pilots the Luftwaffe had been fielding recently. These were seasoned predators. Red flight, extend left. Blue flight, maintain high cover, Wilson commanded, his voice steady despite adrenaline flooding his neural pathways. His squadron had drilled this defensive configuration so extensively it had become neurological reflex. The principle was absolute: never pursue individual targets, never fragment formation chasing glory. Stay with the bombers. Force the Germans to penetrate through them. The Focke-Wulfs committed to their dive, velocity building toward 400 miles per hour. Wilson waited, counting seconds, calculating intercept geometry mentally. At precisely the optimal moment, he guided Red Flight into a climbing turn that positioned 4 Mustangs between the German fighters and the lead bomber element. The engagement devolved into swirling pandemonium of tracer fire and evasive maneuvering. Wilson fired a 3-second burst at a Focke-Wulf passing perpendicular to his flight path, observed his round stitching across the German's wing route. The enemy fighter pulled up aggressively, trailing smoke, then rolled into a spiral that extracted it from the immediate combat zone. But something felt wrong about this engagement. The German fighters weren't disengaging after their initial pass like they typically did when confronted with determined resistance. They were reforming, circling back for another attack run. Wilson's tactical instincts, refined through 87 combat missions, screamed warning. This wasn't a standard raid interception. This was something else. "Talbert, you got eyes on the second wave?" Wilson called to his wingman. "Negative, lead. Skies clear to the north. Wait,
Bandits, 12 o'clock level, range 4 miles. Jesus, there's got to be 30 of them. Wilson's stomach plummeted.
The first group had been a diversion, forcing his fighters to expend ammunition and energy while a substantially larger force maneuvered into position. He'd been manipulated into exactly the kind of engagement he'd spent 2 years avoiding. The second wave consisted of ME-109s and FW-190s in mixed formation, a coordinated assault that suggested meticulous planning rather than opportunistic interception. Wilson executed a split-second calculation. If he maintained defensive position over the bombers, the Germans would simply overwhelm through numerical superiority. But if he took the fight to them, aggressive pursuit that violated his squadron's core doctrine, he might disrupt their formation before they reached the B-17. All flights prepare to engage offensive, Wilson ordered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. We're going to shatter their formation before they reach the package. He pushed his throttle to maximum power and dove toward the approaching German fighters, his squadron following in tight formation. The closure rate was insane. 2 opposing forces hurtling toward each other at combined velocities exceeding 600 miles per hour. In seconds, the orderly tactical picture dissolved into a churning dogfight where friend and foe occupied the same cubic mile of airspace. Wilson found himself on the tail of an ME-109, firing controlled bursts while the German pilot threw his aircraft through violent evasive maneuvers. His guns registered impacts along the fuselage and left wing. The ME-109 snap-rolled right and dove, Wilson pursuing, his airspeed building toward redline as he chased the German down through 15,000 feet. Then he heard the voice he'd been dreading. Bombers under attack, southwest element. 2 bombers hit, 1 going down. Wilson's tactical gamble had failed. By taking the fight to the German fighters, he'd created exactly the gap in defensive coverage they'd been engineering. The Luftwaffe had sacrificed the second wave as another diversion, while a third group, where the hell did they source this many fighters, slipped through to attack the bombers. He abandoned his pursuit and wrenched his Mustang into a punishing 8G turn back toward the bomber formation. His vision grayed at the periphery from sustained G-forces, but he forced the stick harder, trading altitude for velocity in a desperate climb back to 20,000 feet. The scene that greeted him was every escort pilot's nightmare. German fighters swarmed through the bomber formation like wolves among livestock. 2 B-17s trailed fire and smoke, one already in a death spiral with crew members tumbling from emergency exits, parachutes blossoming white against the dark earth below. The remaining bombers had compressed formation, their defensive gunfire creating a cone of tracer rounds and expelled brass. But the Luftwaffe pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Wilson dove back into the fight, but he was out of position, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that had orchestrated this engagement with meticulous care. For the first time in his combat career, he felt genuinely outmaneuvered. The Germans had studied his tactics, identified his squadron's defensive philosophy, and engineered a scenario specifically designed to exploit the one weakness in their doctrine, the impossibility of being in multiple places simultaneously. The debriefing following the Stuttgart mission stretched across 3 hours. Captain Wilson sat in a canvas chair inside the operations tent while an intelligence officer bombarded him with questions about German attack patterns, force composition, and tactical innovations. 2 bombers lost, 7 damaged, 9 crew members killed, 14 wounded. The worst losses Wilson's squadron had sustained while providing escort. They knew, Wilson said quietly, examining his hands. This wasn't random interception. They orchestrated this engagement specifically to defeat our defensive tactics. The intelligence officer, a major from Philadelphia who'd never flown combat, looked skeptical. You're suggesting the Luftwaffe designed an operation to target your squadron specifically? I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating what happened up there. 3 waves of fighters, each positioned to exploit our response to the previous wave. They accepted casualties in the first 2 groups to create openings in the third. That's not standard German tactical doctrine. That's mission-specific planning. To what end? Shooting down 2 bombers hardly justifies the resources you described.
Wilson met the intelligence officer's eyes. It wasn't about the bombers. It was about us. About proving they could beat the Tuskegee pilots. The tent fell silent. Everyone understood what Wilson wasn't articulating directly, that the 332nd Fighter Group's race made them targets beyond normal military considerations. The Luftwaffe wasn't just fighting American pilots. They were fighting the symbolic threat those pilots represented to Nazi ideology. Colonel Benjamin Davis, the 332nd's commanding officer, arrived at the debriefing midway through. He listened to Wilson's account without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Wilson finished, Davis dismissed the intelligence officer and secured the tent flap. "How many missions have you flown, Captain?" Davis asked. 87, sir. "And in those 87 missions, how many times have you encountered tactical planning this sophisticated?" "Never, sir. The Luftwaffe has skilled pilots, but their command structure is fragmented. They don't typically coordinate complex operations across multiple fighter groups." Davis nodded slowly. "I received a classified briefing last week from Theater Intelligence. They're monitoring German radio traffic for references to our unit. In the past month, mentions have increased by 300%. The Germans are discussing us constantly, our tactics, our performance record, our distinctive characteristics." Wilson understood immediately. They're obsessed. Worse than obsessed. They're ideologically threatened, and desperate men make dangerous choices. Davis extracted a folder from his briefcase and removed several reconnaissance photographs. These were taken by high-altitude recon flights over Luftwaffe bases in southern Germany. "Notice anything unusual?" Wilson studied the images. They depicted fighter aircraft concentrations far exceeding normal defensive deployments. They're staging forces, preparing for something big. Intelligence estimates they've pulled fighters from 3 different defensive sectors and concentrated them near probable bomber routes. They're sacrificing protection over German cities to mass forces in specific areas where they expect to encounter us. The implications were staggering. The Luftwaffe was so fixated on destroying the 332nd that they were accepting strategic vulnerability elsewhere. Hitler's Air Force was making operationally unsound decisions driven by ideological imperatives rather than military logic. "What do we do, sir?" Wilson asked. Davis was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the folder. "We adapt. The defensive tactics that served us well for 6 months are now a liability. The Germans have solved that puzzle, so we give them a different puzzle to solve." Over the following week, Davis redesigned the 332nd's tactical doctrine. Instead of pure defensive escort, they would operate in layered formations, some flights maintaining tight bomber protection, while others positioned themselves to counter German responses to the defensive elements. It was chess played in 3 dimensions at 300 miles per hour, requiring trust and communication that exceeded anything demanded of pilots in other fighter groups. Wilson spent hours with his flight leaders, rehearsing the new patterns over the Italian countryside. The pilots understood what was at stake. They were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, the military conflict against Germany and the ideological conflict against everyone who believed black men couldn't excel as combat aviators. "My brother wrote me last week," Lieutenant Charles Bailey mentioned during a training break. "He's still in Alabama working at the Tuskegee base as a mechanic. Says he follows our mission reports like baseball scores. Says people back home are watching everything we do. No pressure," another pilot joked, but the humor fell flat. They all felt the weight of representation, the knowledge that their performance would be generalized across an entire race by people seeking reasons to confirm their prejudices. Wilson redirected the conversation. "Let's run the split-stack formation one more time. Germans are going to throw everything at us next mission, and we need this pattern automatic." They flew training exercises until fuel reserves ran low, then debriefed, ate, slept, and repeated the cycle. Word came down through channels that the next major bombing raid would target aircraft manufacturing facilities near Munich, a high-value target that guaranteed heavy Luftwaffe response. The night before the mission, Wilson lay in his bunk, listening to distant artillery fire from the Italian front. He thought about the German pilots who would try to kill him tomorrow, wondered if any of them questioned the ideology that made this fight personal rather than purely military. Probably not. People rarely examined the foundations of their worldview, especially when those foundations justified their position in the social hierarchy.
He also thought about the Führer sitting in his bunker somewhere in Germany, obsessing over reconnaissance photographs of red-tailed Mustangs. Hitler had built an empire on the promise of Aryan supremacy, and now that empire was crumbling while black pilots protected American bombers with unprecedented effectiveness. The cognitive dissonance must be excruciating. Good, let it hurt. Let every successful mission gnaw at Hitler's certainty. Let the gap between Nazi theory and observable reality grow until it swallowed the entire rotten ideology whole. Wilson closed his eyes and forced himself towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring another battle in the endless war. But tomorrow the 332nd would fly new patterns designed to counter German adaptations. They would demonstrate the same flexibility and tactical innovation that had made them the most effective escort group in the Mediterranean theater. And somewhere in Germany, someone would file another report that contradicted everything the Nazis promised about racial hierarchy. The cumulative weight of those contradictions might not end the war, but they would contribute to demolishing the lies that started it. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, the Führer's rage manifested as glacial silence rather than the anticipated explosion. Goering stood at attention in the briefing room, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the February chill, watching Hitler study the Munich mission after-action reports with the methodical attention of a pathologist examining tissue samples for malignancy. "You concentrated 43 fighters from 3 separate groups," Hitler said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You engineered an engagement specifically designed to overwhelm the 332nd through numerical superiority and tactical surprise. And the result was, remind me of the result, Reichsmarschall." Goering cleared his throat. 4 German fighters lost, 7 damaged. American losses were 2 bombers, 1 Mustang. The red-tailed pilots adapted to our 3-wave attack pattern within minutes and established a defensive configuration our pilots had not encountered previously. They adapted. Hitler set down the reports with precise, controlled movements that were somehow more terrifying than thrown objects. They adapted to tactics we developed specifically to counter their previous methods. Do you understand what this indicates about their training, their tactical flexibility, their command structure? Mein Führer, it indicates they are better than our pilots. Hitler's voice remained quiet, but each word landed like a physical blow. It indicates that Negroes, who according to our racial science should be intellectually inferior, are demonstrating cognitive abilities and tactical innovation that surpass the performance of German aces. Do you grasp the implications? Goering said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make the situation worse. Hitler stood and walked to the map wall displaying Luftwaffe deployment across Europe. Red pins marked fighter concentrations. Blue pins showed American bomber routes. Green pins indicated the 332nd Fighter Group's known operating areas. The green pins haunted Hitler's strategic vision like infections on an X-ray. Goebbels wants to suppress all information about these pilots, Hitler continued. He believes we can simply pretend they don't exist, that we can control the narrative through propaganda. But you can't propaganda your way out of observable reality. Our pilots know. Their reports circulate. Soldiers talk. And every conversation where someone mentions the exceptional Black American Fighter Group is a conversation that undermines everything we've built. What do you propose, Mein Führer? Hitler turned from the map, his expression shifting into something that made Goering's blood run cold. It was the look Hitler got when he moved beyond conventional solutions into the realm of desperate measures that violated normal military ethics. I propose we stop pretending this is a conventional military problem, Hitler said. The 332nd Fighter Group is an ideological threat that requires an ideological response. You will coordinate with Himmler and the SS intelligence services. I want options that go beyond aerial combat. Goering felt ice form in his stomach. When Hitler invoked Himmler and SS intelligence, the discussion moved beyond military operations into darker territory. Sabotage, assassination, psychological warfare operations that existed in moral gray zones no professional soldier wanted to enter. You're suggesting unconventional operations against the American pilots? I'm suggesting we exploit every vulnerability, Hitler replied. These pilots operate from Italian air bases. They rely on fuel supplies, maintenance crews, ground support infrastructure. They have predictable patterns, known locations. If we cannot defeat them in the air through conventional means, we defeat them through other methods. Göring understood the order without needing explicit details spelled out. Hitler wanted the 332nd Fighter Group destroyed through any means necessary. Sabotage of aircraft, attacks on ground facilities, perhaps even targeted operations against individual pilots. It was the kind of asymmetric warfare Germany usually condemned when enemies employed it against German forces. Mein Führer, targeting specific American units for special operations, could invite retaliation against our own forces. The Americans will do nothing, Hitler interrupted, because they won't acknowledge what makes this unit special. They can't publicize the race of these pilots without highlighting their own military segregation and domestic racial policies. We operate in a space where both sides have incentive to maintain silence. That gives us freedom of action. It was twisted logic, but not entirely wrong. The American military did maintain segregation. News coverage of the Tuskegee Airmen back in the United States was limited and carefully controlled. Both nations had reasons to keep this particular story quiet, which meant operations against the 332nd might be conducted in a shadow war where normal rules didn't apply. Göring departed the meeting with orders to coordinate with SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of Reich Security Main Office. The prospect of involving Kaltenbrunner, a man whose idea of tactical innovation involved Gestapo torture techniques, in military operations made Göring nauseous. But Hitler had given explicit orders, and disobeying the Führer in February 1944 was tantamount to suicide. 3 days later, Göring found himself in a different briefing room with very different attendees. Kaltenbrunner sat across the table, his scarred face impassive, flanked by 2 SS intelligence officers who took notes with the mechanical precision of men documenting atrocities for future reference. The Führer has requested contingency operations against the American 332nd Fighter Group, Göring began, hating every word. Specifically operations that exploit ground-based vulnerabilities rather than aerial engagement. Kaltenbrunner smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. I've already begun preliminary analysis. The unit operates from Ramatelli Airfield in southern Italy. Security there is standard American military, competent but not exceptional. Italian partisan activity in the region provides cover for infiltration operations. We have assets in place. What kind of operations are you proposing? Several options exist on a spectrum from harassment to elimination. Kaltenbrunner opened a leather folder and extracted typed documents. Option 1. Sabotage of fuel supplies through chemical contamination. Would render aircraft inoperable without obvious cause, create maintenance delays and operational uncertainty. Low risk, moderate impact. Göring nodded, though the idea of poisoning fuel supplies felt like crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Option 2. Direct attack on ground facilities using partisan cover. Small arms fire, mortar attacks on maintenance hangars and pilot quarters. Higher risk, but creates casualties and forces pilots to focus on ground security rather than mission preparation. Psychological impact significant. And option 3, Kaltenbrunner's smile widened. Targeted operations against individual pilots, accidents during off-duty hours, vehicle malfunctions, contaminated rations, deaths that appear random or attributable to normal wartime hazards, eliminates experienced pilots permanently, forces Americans to replace them with less capable aviators. The room fell silent. Göring had fought in World War I, had witnessed the worst conventional warfare offered, but there existed an unspoken code among military aviators. You fought in the sky according to rules that preserved some scrap of honor. Kaltenbrunner was proposing murder disguised as accidents, assassination of enemy pilots outside combat operations. This crosses ethical boundaries, Göring said carefully. Ethics are luxuries for nations that can afford them.
Kaltenbrunner replied. Germany is fighting for survival. The Führer has identified the 332nd as an ideological threat that undermines our foundational principles. Eliminating that threat through unconventional means is strategic necessity, not ethical failure. Göring wanted to argue, wanted to reject the entire proposal and walk out of the briefing, but he'd seen what happened to officers who defied Hitler's explicit orders. The concentration camps weren't reserved exclusively for Jews and political prisoners anymore. Anyone deemed defeatist or insufficiently committed to total war could find themselves on trains heading east. I'll present these options to the Führer, Göring said, gathering the documents. Final authorization must come from him directly. Of course, Kaltenbrunner agreed, though I suspect we both know which option he'll choose. The prediction proved accurate. When Göring briefed Hitler on the three options, the Führer selected option 2, direct attacks on ground facilities, with authorization for escalation to option 3 if opportunities presented themselves. Hitler wanted the 332nd to feel hunted, to experience the same psychological pressure they'd been inflicting on German forces through their exceptional performance. Orders went out through encrypted channels to SS operatives in Italy. Plans were drawn for attacks on Ramitelli airfield, timed to coincide with the next major bombing operation, forcing the Americans to divide attention between aerial combat and ground security. It was asymmetric warfare at its most ruthless, driven not by military necessity but by one man's inability to reconcile observable reality with ideological certainty. Meanwhile, at Ramitelli airfield, Captain Wilson and his fellow pilots prepared for their next mission, unaware that the war had expanded beyond aerial combat into something darker and more personal. They focused on flight training, aircraft maintenance, mission briefings, the normal rhythm of military aviation. They didn't know they'd become targets of an obsession that extended from Hitler's bunker to SS planning rooms to partisan operatives moving through Italian countryside with weapons and explosives. The Shadow War was beginning, and nobody on the American side recognized the danger until it was too late. The explosion detonated at 03:47 hours on March 8, 1944. Captain Wilson was wrenched from sleep by a concussive blast that shook his bunk and shattered windows in the pilot quarters. He rolled to the floor instinctively, pulse hammering, reaching for the pistol he kept in a holster hanging from his bedpost. Outside, orange flames climbed into the pre-dawn sky from the maintenance hangar. Secondary explosions followed, fuel drums igniting in chain reaction, ammunition cooking off in the heat, the distinctive crack of ordnance detonating. Wilson pulled on boots and ran toward the flight line with dozens of other pilots and ground crew, all of them moving toward the fire, despite every survival instinct screaming to run the opposite direction. The maintenance hangar was a total loss. 3 P-51 Mustangs inside had been destroyed, their aluminum airframes melting into abstract sculptures in the 2,000-degree heat. Worse was the human cost. 2 mechanics who'd been working night shift on engine repairs were dead. Their bodies recovered from the wreckage after the fires were finally contained at dawn. Colonel Davis ordered a full investigation. Military police cordoned off the area, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses. The official determination came back within hours. Accidental explosion caused by fuel vapor ignition. Tragic, but not unprecedented. These things happened in wartime operations where exhausted crews worked with volatile materials under pressure, but Wilson didn't believe it. Neither did most of the other pilots. The maintenance hangar had operated for 9 months without incident. The crew chiefs were experienced, careful men who understood fuel safety procedures intimately, and the timing was suspicious, occurring just hours before a scheduled mission to Munich that would have deployed all available aircraft. Someone got inside our perimeter, Wilson told Davis during a private meeting in the colonel's office. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. Davis studied the MP investigation report, his expression unreadable. The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. No signs of forced entry, no unexploded ordnance, no witnesses reporting suspicious activity. Because whoever did this knew what they were doing. Professional operation, not partisan amateurs. Wilson leaned forward. Sir, we both know the Germans have been obsessed with this unit. We've seen the tactical adaptations, the concentrated forces. This is escalation, taking the fight to us on the ground because they can't beat us in the air. Even if you're right, what do you propose? We can't prove German involvement. Theater Command won't authorize retaliation based on speculation, and going public with accusations means explaining why the Germans might target us specifically, which means discussing race in official channels. That's a conversation nobody in the chain of command wants to have. Wilson sat back, frustrated by the impossible position. They were being targeted because of who they were, but acknowledging that targeting meant acknowledging the racial dynamics everyone pretended didn't exist. The conspiracy of silence protected the Germans more effectively than any air defense system. Over the following weeks, additional incidents occurred with disturbing regularity. A fuel truck's brake lines failed, sending it careening into a parked aircraft. Contaminated rations sickened 12 pilots with food poisoning severe enough to ground them for a week. Small arms fire from nearby hills peppered the airfield during evening hours, forcing pilots to sprint between buildings under combat conditions. Each incident was individually explainable as accident or random partisan activity, but collectively they formed a pattern of harassment designed to degrade operational effectiveness through death by 1,000 cuts. The 332nd's mission-ready aircraft count dropped from 43 to 31. Pilot fatigue increased from constant security alerts and interrupted sleep. Ground crew morale deteriorated as mechanics worked overtime to repair sabotage damage disguised as mechanical failures. The psychological impact was exactly what Hitler had intended. Pilots who should have been focused on aerial tactics spent energy watching for infiltrators. Maintenance crews inspected aircraft with paranoid thoroughness, adding hours to routine procedures. The unit's effectiveness declined, not because the Germans had beaten them in combat, but because they'd introduced an element of uncertainty and dread that sapped energy and attention. Wilson noticed the change in his own performance. During missions, part of his mind remained at Ramitelli, worrying about what might be happening while he was away. The mental split degraded his tactical decision-making in subtle but measurable ways. His gunnery accuracy dropped 3%. His reaction time to radio calls increased by fractions of seconds.
Small degradations, but in aerial combat where margins determined survival, even small degradations mattered. Colonel Davis requested additional security from Theater Command, more MPs, better perimeter defenses, counterintelligence support, but resources were stretched thin across the Italian theater. American forces were preparing for the Anzio breakout and the push north toward Rome. Nobody wanted to divert assets to protect one fighter group from hypothetical threats with no definitive proof. "We're on our own," Davis told his senior pilots during a command meeting. "Theater won't help us because helping us means acknowledging we need special protection because of who we are. That acknowledgement opens questions about why we're segregated in the first place, so we adapt with organic resources." They implemented their own security measures. Pilots volunteered for guard duty, rotating watches through the night. Ground crews devised inspection protocols that checked every system on every aircraft before flight operations. They installed motion sensors around the perimeter and established rapid response teams that could mobilize within seconds of alarm. It was exhausting work on top of regular combat operations, but slowly the security improvements showed results. A partisan infiltrator was caught placing explosives near the fuel depot and captured before he could detonate them. Under interrogation, he admitted to being paid by German intelligence through intermediaries. Another infiltrator was intercepted near the pilot quarters with poisoned needles meant to be introduced into food supplies. The captures confirmed what Wilson had suspected. They were targets of a coordinated German campaign operating outside conventional military operations. But confirmation didn't help much when nobody with authority wanted to acknowledge the campaign publicly. Then on April 3, 1944, everything changed. Lieutenant Samuel Harris didn't return from a mission over Vienna. His aircraft was last seen breaking from formation after taking flak damage, heading south toward Allied lines. Search efforts found no trace of wreckage, no parachute, no emergency beacon signal. 3 days later, Harris's body was recovered from a field 20 miles from Ramitelli. He'd successfully bailed out from his damaged aircraft and parachuted safely. The cause of death wasn't flak wounds or crash injuries. It was 3 gunshot wounds to the back of the head at close range. Execution-style murder after capture. Something that violated every convention of warfare regarding prisoners. The Italian partisans who found the body also found a note pinned to Harris's flight suit. The message was typed in German, translated later by intelligence officers. "This is what happens to inferior races who dare to challenge Aryan supremacy." More will follow unless the colored American pilots are withdrawn from combat operations. The note found on Lieutenant Harris's body landed like a grenade in American military intelligence offices. For 18 months, the American command structure had maintained careful silence about the 332nd Fighter Group's racial composition, treating them like any other unit in official communications. The German note obliterated that fiction with 3 typed paragraphs of explicit racial threat. Colonel Davis was summoned to headquarters in Naples to brief General Ira Eaker, commander of Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. The meeting room held more brass than Davis typically encountered: generals, colonels, intelligence officers, political advisors who'd arrived from Washington on emergency flights. Everyone needed to understand what was happening and decide how to respond. The Germans have taken this beyond military operations, Davis explained, standing before a room full of senior officers. Lieutenant Harris was executed after capture specifically because of his race. The note makes that explicit. We're not facing conventional enemy actions anymore. We're facing war crimes motivated by ideology. General Eaker studied the translated note, his face grim. This creates impossible complications. If we publicize this, we acknowledge the racial targeting, which means discussing segregation in American forces. Congress will have hearings. Civil rights groups will demand integration. Southern senators will fight to maintain current policies. We'll spend more energy fighting political battles than fighting Germans. With respect, General, Lieutenant Harris is dead, Davis replied, his voice carefully controlled. 2 more of my pilots are missing after recent missions. My mechanics have been killed in sabotage attacks. At what point does protecting the domestic political situation become less important than protecting American servicemen from war crimes? The room fell silent. Everyone understood Davis's argument was morally unassailable, but politically impossible. The American military in 1944 was deeply invested in segregation as policy. Acknowledging that segregation made black servicemen targets for special German attention meant admitting segregation had operational consequences beyond domestic politics. A political advisor from the State Department spoke up. If we go public with accusations of racial war crimes, it gives Germany ammunition for propaganda. They'll point to American lynchings, Jim Crow laws, race riots. They'll argue, quite effectively, that America has no moral authority to condemn Germany's racial policies when our own practices are documented and ongoing. So we do nothing? Davis asked. We let German intelligence murder American pilots because acknowledging the murders is politically inconvenient? General Eaker raised a hand. Nobody's suggesting we do nothing, Colonel. We're trying to find a response that protects your pilots without creating a propaganda disaster for the Allied cause. Those are not mutually exclusive objectives. Over the following hours, the assembled officers debated options. Some argued for quiet diplomatic pressure through neutral intermediaries, lodging formal protests about treatment of captured aviators without specifically mentioning race. Others suggested military retaliation, targeted operations against German intelligence facilities, tit-for-tat escalation that stayed below public visibility. Davis listened to the discussions with growing frustration. Everyone focused on managing political fallout and propaganda implications, while his pilots continued flying missions with targets on their backs. The institutionalized racism that created segregated military units was now actively endangering lives, and the same institutional structures prevented addressing the danger directly. Finally, Davis stood and interrupted a theoretical discussion about international Red Cross involvement. Gentlemen, while we're debating diplomatic protocols, my pilots are facing an enemy that's trying to kill them both in the air and on the ground. I need concrete action, not political strategy sessions. Eaker nodded. You're right, Colonel. Here's what we'll do immediately. First, I'm authorizing dedicated counterintelligence resources for your unit. Experienced OSS operatives who specialize in infiltration detection and partisan network disruption. Second, we'll establish a rapid response force of military police specifically assigned to Ramatelli security. Third, we'll rotate your unit's operational base periodically to prevent Germans from establishing surveillance patterns. What about retaliation for Lieutenant Harris? Davis asked. Officially, we can't acknowledge race-based targeting without political authorization from Washington. Eaker glanced at the intelligence officers present. Unofficially, efforts will be made to identify and neutralize the German intelligence networks operating in southern Italy. Some of those efforts might be more aggressive than standard counterintelligence operations. Is that sufficient? Davis understood the subtext. The American military would respond to German war crimes through covert operations that maintained plausible deniability. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Thank you, General. My pilots will continue their mission. I know they will, Eaker replied. And Colonel, for what it's worth, the performance of the 332nd has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels. General Eisenhower specifically mentioned your unit in a recent briefing, praising the bomber protection statistics. There are conversations happening about integration, about changing policies after the war. What you and your pilots are accomplishing has impact beyond the immediate military situation. Davis nodded, but felt no satisfaction. Change after the war wouldn't help Lieutenant Harris or the other pilots targeted by German obsession. They needed protection now, not promises about future policy reforms. Back at Ramitelli, Davis briefed his senior pilots on the Naples meeting. Captain Wilson listened to the report with mixed emotions: relief that additional security was coming, anger that it had taken a pilot's execution to prompt action, cynicism about whether anything would fundamentally change. They want us to keep flying, Wilson said after Davis finished. Keep providing exceptional bomber protection so the statistics prove our worth. But don't make too much noise about the extra dangers we're facing, because that's politically complicated. That's an uncharitable but not inaccurate summary, Davis admitted. The question is whether we continue under these circumstances or request reassignment to duties with less exposure.
We continue, Wilson said immediately. Other pilots around the briefing table nodded agreement. We continue because every successful mission proves something important. We continue because retreat validates exactly what Hitler believes about us. We continue because that's what soldiers do. We complete the mission regardless of circumstances. Davis smiled grimly. I was hoping you'd say that, because I already told General Eaker we'd maintain full operational tempo. Now let's discuss the tactical changes we're implementing to protect yourselves both in the air and on the ground. Over the following weeks, the 332nd adapted to their new reality as targets of a shadow war. OSS operatives arrived at Ramitelli, experienced intelligence officers who'd operated behind enemy lines and understood German tactics intimately. They established counter-surveillance protocols, ran background checks on Italian civilian employees, and built informant networks in nearby villages to detect infiltration attempts before they reached the airfield. Meanwhile, the 332nd continued flying combat missions with the same effectiveness that had made them targets in the first place. They protected bomber formations, tangled with Luftwaffe interceptors, and maintained their near-zero bomber loss record that drove Hitler's obsession to new heights. But now every mission carried additional weight. The pilots understood they were fighting for something beyond military objectives. They were fighting to prove their humanity to an enemy that denied it existed. They were fighting to validate their worth to a nation that segregated them. They were fighting to survive threats that operated outside the normal rules of warfare. And somewhere in Germany, Hitler followed their continued success with rage that burned colder and more dangerous as evidence mounted that his fundamental worldview was fiction built on lies. By May 1944, Hitler's preoccupation with the 332nd Fighter Group had metastasized from strategic concern into personal fixation that alarmed even his closest advisors. He demanded daily briefings on the unit's activities, studied reconnaissance photographs with magnifying glasses, and erupted into rages when reports indicated continued American bombing success under their protection. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, watched the Führer's mental state deteriorate with growing concern. The man who had once commanded armies across multiple fronts now spent hours analyzing tactical reports about one fighter squadron. It was as if Hitler's entire conception of reality hinged on destroying these specific pilots or proving their success was somehow fraudulent. The Americans lost 3 bombers over Pest yesterday, Bormann mentioned during a morning briefing, attempting to redirect Hitler's attention toward more strategically significant matters. Our Romanian oil production continues despite heavy raids. Hitler barely glanced at the Pest report. Were the red-tailed fighters present at Pest? 9, mein Führer. Intelligence indicates they were assigned to the Munich raid that same day. And the Munich raid results? Bormann consulted his notes reluctantly. 17 bombers reached their targets. No losses during the mission. 2 bombers damaged by flak, but safely returned to base. Hitler's jaw clenched. 0 losses again. How many consecutive missions has the 332nd completed with 0 bomber losses under their protection? 86, mein Führer. The number hung in the air like an indictment. 68 missions where black American pilots had performed flawlessly, protecting their charges through concentrated German fighter opposition and heavy anti-aircraft fire. 68 data points that contradicted Nazi racial theory so fundamentally that acknowledging them would require dismantling the ideological foundations of the regime. Goebbels had given up trying to suppress information about the Tuskegee Airmen through propaganda. Too many German pilots had encountered them. Too many reports documented their effectiveness. Instead, Goebbels had shifted strategy to alternative explanations. Perhaps the Americans gave these pilots easier assignments. Perhaps their aircraft were superior. Perhaps they avoided combat whenever possible. But none of the alternative explanations survived contact with actual combat reports. The 332nd flew the same missions as white fighter groups, often facing heavier opposition. Their aircraft were standard P-51 Mustangs, identical to those flown by other units, and their engagement statistics showed aggressive combat tactics, not cautious avoidance. The truth was undeniable. Black American pilots were outperforming their white counterparts and humiliating the Luftwaffe in the process. And that truth was eating Hitler alive from the inside. "I want the Italian infiltration operations escalated," Hitler ordered. "I want attacks on their airfield doubled. I want every resource we can spare directed at destroying this unit." "Mein Führer," Bormann said carefully, "the resources required for infiltration operations in Italy are considerable. We're also facing Allied advances on the Italian front, preparing for the anticipated invasion of France and managing partisan activity across occupied territories. Concentrating assets against one American fighter group means accepting degraded capability elsewhere." "I don't care." Hitler's voice had dropped to the whisper that preceded his legendary tantrums. "This isn't about military efficiency anymore. This is about proving that our fundamental understanding of the world is correct. If Negroes can excel as fighter pilots, if racial inferiors can defeat Aryan warriors, then everything we've built is based on lies. Everything we've promised the German people is fiction. I won't accept that conclusion. I can't accept it." Bormann recognized the psychological spiral. Hitler had constructed his entire political movement on racial hierarchy. Admitting that hierarchy was false meant confronting the monstrosity of everything done in its name. The concentration camps, the mass murders, the aggressive wars justified by theories of Aryan supremacy. The cognitive dissonance was too massive to acknowledge directly. So Hitler's mind found the only available escape route, denying reality itself. "I'll convey your orders to the appropriate agencies," Bormann said quietly. Over the following weeks, German resources flowed toward Italian infiltration operations in quantities that made no strategic sense. SS operatives who should have been tracking partisan networks instead focused on penetrating Ramatelli airfield security. Weapons and explosives earmarked for anti-partisan operations were redirected to sabotage missions targeting the 332nd. German intelligence officers built detailed profiles of individual American pilots looking for exploitable vulnerabilities. But the Americans had adapted. The OSS counterintelligence teams detected infiltration attempts before they reached critical targets. Security at Ramatelli had been hardened to levels normally reserved for command headquarters, and the pilots themselves maintained vigilance both in the air and on the ground, operating as a cohesive unit that watched for threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The shadow war that Hitler had initiated was failing, just like the conventional aerial campaign had failed. But failure only intensified Hitler's obsession. If reality wouldn't conform to his ideology, he would simply reject reality and construct an alternative narrative where his beliefs remained valid. In June 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and opened the second front Hitler had dreaded, the Führer spent his morning briefing discussing tactics for destroying the 332nd Fighter Group. His generals exchanged worried glances but said nothing. Everyone understood that Hitler's mental state was precarious, that his grip on reality had loosened to the point where fantasy and fact blurred together. The man who had once conquered most of Europe was now reduced to obsessing over American pilots he would never meet, whose success undermined everything he believed.
It was a fitting tragedy. Hitler destroyed by the simple observable fact that human capability wasn't distributed according to his racial theories. Meanwhile, Captain Wilson and his fellow pilots continued their mission, unaware they occupied such a central position in Hitler's disintegrating worldview. They flew, fought, protected bombers, and returned to base to repeat the cycle. They dealt with infiltration attempts, investigated sabotage, mourned pilots lost to war crimes, and adapted to circumstances beyond their control. They did what soldiers have always done when faced with impossible situations. They focused on the mission, supported their brothers in arms, and refused to surrender to fear or hatred or despair. And in doing so, they won a victory more profound than any tactical engagement. They proved through undeniable demonstration that ideology based on racial hierarchy was fiction, that human potential transcended the artificial categories bigotry imposed. Hitler would never admit that truth. His ideology couldn't survive contact with it. But history would record the facts regardless of what Hitler chose to believe. The Tuskegee Airmen flew, fought, and excelled despite facing enemies on multiple fronts. Their success was documented, verified, and impossible to deny except through willful blindness. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its armies defeated, its cities ruined, its Führer dead by suicide in a Berlin bunker, while Soviet shells reduced the capital to rubble. The 1,000-year Reich Hitler had promised lasted 12 years and left Europe in ashes. Captain Robert Wilson stood on the tarmac at Ramitelli on VE Day, watching mechanics paint victory symbols on the red-tailed Mustangs that had carried them through 2 years of combat. The 332nd Fighter Group had completed 200 bomber escort missions. They had damaged or destroyed 409 German aircraft, and they had maintained the most exceptional bomber protection record of any escort group in the war, flying 179 missions where not a single bomber under their protection was lost to enemy fighters. The statistics were undeniable. The record was verified by multiple sources and confirmed through exhaustive documentation. Black American pilots had not merely performed adequately, they had excelled beyond the standards achieved by any comparable unit. But VE Day celebrations felt muted for Wilson and his fellow pilots. They'd won the war against Germany, but they were returning to an America where segregation remained legal, where Jim Crow laws denied them basic civil rights, where the same nation they'd fought to protect refused them service at restaurants and hotels because of skin color. Colonel Davis gathered his pilots for a final briefing as the unit prepared to redeploy stateside. "What we accomplished here will echo for generations," Davis said. "We proved something that racists claimed was impossible. We demonstrated excellence under circumstances designed to ensure our failure, and we did it with honor, discipline, and courage that nobody can dispute." "Will it matter?" Lieutenant Bailey asked. "Will anything change back home because we shot down German planes?" Davis was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Change comes slowly. But we've given people who advocate for justice undeniable evidence. We've made it impossible for anyone to claim with a straight face that black Americans can't perform at the highest levels in the most demanding circumstances. That's not nothing." Wilson thought about Lieutenant Harris, executed by German infiltrators for having the audacity to challenge Nazi racial theories by existing as an excellent pilot. He thought about the mechanics killed in sabotage attacks, the pilots lost to war crimes that operated outside conventional combat. He thought about Hitler, obsessing over reconnaissance photographs in his bunker, unable to reconcile reality with ideology. The victory felt incomplete because the war had revealed truths that many people weren't ready to accept. Germany had built an empire on racial hierarchy and been defeated by a coalition that included soldiers from dozens of ethnicities and backgrounds. The Tuskegee Airmen had demonstrated that capability transcended racial categories. But acknowledging those truths required surrendering prejudices that gave people comfort and social position. "What happened to Hitler in the end?" Wilson asked.
Did we ever get confirmation about his final response to us? Davis nodded. Intelligence recovered documents from the Reich Chancellery before Soviet forces completely occupied Berlin. Apparently, Hitler spent his final weeks obsessing over Luftwaffe combat reports. One of his last recorded statements to Bormann included references to the Negro fighter problem and how it represented the ultimate betrayal by reality itself. The phrase hung in the air, betrayal by reality itself. It captured something essential about Hitler's psychology, and by extension, the psychology of anyone who built their worldview on racial hierarchy. When evidence contradicted their beliefs, they didn't change beliefs. They claimed evidence was lying. As the 332nd prepared to leave Italy, Wilson reflected on what they'd accomplished beyond the military statistics. They'd forced an entire ideology to confront its own falseness. They'd demonstrated truths about human capability that no amount of propaganda could suppress. They'd won battles in the air and fought a shadow war on the ground, all while representing something larger than themselves. The journey home would be complicated. They'd return as decorated veterans who had served their country with distinction, only to face a nation that still denied them equal rights. But they'd also return with evidence nobody could dismiss: combat records, verified mission reports, documented success that established new standards for excellence in military aviation. Years later, historians would study the Tuskegee Airmen's record and recognize its significance extended beyond military achievement. The 332nd Fighter Group had participated in a larger battle about human potential and the lies people told themselves about racial hierarchy. Their success didn't immediately change American society, but it provided ammunition for civil rights advocates who fought those battles in courts, legislatures, and streets across America. Hitler's response to their success, the obsession, the war crimes, the desperate attempts to destroy them through unconventional means, revealed the fragility of ideology based on false premises. When reality contradicted Nazi racial theory, Hitler couldn't adapt his theory to accommodate reality. He could only double down on the lies and try to eliminate the evidence that exposed them. The Tuskegee Airmen flew home carrying knowledge that would shape their lives forever. They'd seen the worst of what racial hatred could produce: concentration camps liberated by Allied forces, victims of industrialized genocide, the smoking ruins of cities destroyed in service of ideology. They'd fought against that evil and won, but they'd also learned that evil wasn't confined to enemy nations. Prejudice existed everywhere, in different forms and intensities. The fight for equality would continue long after the war ended, fought on different battlefields against different enemies. As Wilson's transport aircraft lifted off from Italian soil for the final time, he looked down at Ramitelli Airfield, growing smaller beneath him. 2 years of his life had been spent at that base, fighting multiple wars simultaneously. He'd lost friends, survived assassination attempts, and participated in one of history's most significant demonstrations that human capability transcended racial categories. The victory was real but incomplete. The war had ended, but the larger struggle for recognition of fundamental human equality would continue for decades. The Tuskegee Airmen had won their battles, but the war against prejudice required generations of continued fighting. Still, as Wilson watched Italy disappear beneath the clouds, he felt something approaching satisfaction. They'd done what they set out to do: prove excellence under impossible circumstances, maintain honor despite facing enemies who fought without it, and establish a record that nobody could dismiss or diminish. Hitler had tried to destroy them because their existence contradicted his ideology. He'd failed. They'd survived, excelled, and left evidence that would outlive the Reich by centuries. In the end, reality had betrayed Hitler's worldview because his worldview was built on lies. The Tuskegee Airmen had simply existed as living proof those lies were false. That was victory enough. Thanks for staying with us through this incredible journey. If this story resonated with you the way it did with us while researching and crafting it, we'd be grateful if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely makes a difference and helps us continue bringing these buried historical narratives into the light. We're curious. What other overlooked World War II stories do you believe deserve this kind of attention? What hidden chapters of history should we explore next? Share your suggestions in the comments below. We read every one, and your ideas often shape the stories we tell.